Commander Jake Matthews had developed a ritual over his 15 years patrolling the Outer Rim. Every evening at 2100 hours, he would sit in his quarters aboard the patrol cruiser Vengeance, disassemble his military-issue plasma sidearm, and clean each component with the meticulous care of a man who understood that, in the black void of space, your weapon might be the only thing standing between you and death. The repetitive motion of running the cleaning rod through the barrel had become meditation, a way to process another day of protecting humanity's far-flung colonies from the dangers that lurked in the darkness between stars. The weapon was a Mark 7 Terran Defense Force, standard issue, nothing fancy, but reliable as sunrise on Earth. Matthews had carried variations of this same pistol through 3 different conflicts, and it had never failed him. Not when pirates tried to board the cargo hauler Independence 5 years ago. Not when those crystalline entities had attacked the mining station at Kepler 442. The gun was an old friend, and cleaning it was like having a conversation with that friend about the day's events. But tonight, something felt different. Maybe it was the eerie silence that had settled over the ship. The Vengeance was running a standard patrol route through the outer colony's protection zone, a stretch of space so quiet that most crews called it the graveyard shift. Out here, the worst thing you usually encountered was a malfunctioning navigation beacon, or maybe some asteroid miners who'd had too much to drink and were flying erratically. Matthews was just reassembling the trigger mechanism when the emergency beacon screamed through the ship's communication system. Like a banshee from hell, the sound was designed to cut through anything combat noise, engine roar, even the deep sleep of exhausted crew members. It was a sound that meant one thing. Somewhere out there, human beings were dying and calling for help. Matthews had heard that sound maybe a dozen times in his career, and it never failed to turn his blood to liquid nitrogen. But this time was different. This time, the voice that came through the static wasn't the calm, professional tone of a trained merchant marine or military officer. This was raw terror, the kind of fear that strips away everything civilized about a person and reduces them to their most primal instincts. Mayday, mayday, ... This is the cargo hauler Promise, ... Coordinates 7-7-Alpha-9-9 We're under attack. Unknown vessels, ... They're not responding to hails. The voice belonged to a man, probably middle-aged, based on the gravelly quality, but it was pitched high with panic. Matthews could hear other voices in the background shouting, crying, the distinctive whine of energy weapons powering up. They're breaching the hull. The man continued, his voice cracking. Sections 4 through 7 are venting atmosphere. Oh Jesus, they're not taking prisoners. They're just killing everyone. Matthews dropped the cleaning rod. It clattered to the deck of his quarters, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden silence that followed. He'd heard distress calls before, but this was different. This wasn't pirates looking for easy cargo, or alien traders having a territorial dispute. This was systematic slaughter. The transmission continued, but now the man's voice was barely coherent through his terror. They're in the children's section. Oh God, they're targeting the children's section. They're laughing. Why are they laughing? And then came the sound that would haunt Matthews for the rest of his life. Children screaming, not the annoyed screams of kids who didn't want to go to bed, or the excited screams of playground games. These were screams of pure terror. The sound of young minds trying to process something too horrible to understand. The transmission cut to static, then nothing. For a moment, Matthews sat frozen in his chair, his hands still holding pieces of his disassembled weapon. His mind, trained by years of military service to process information quickly and efficiently, was struggling to accept what he'd just heard. Someone had just massacred an entire civilian transport, and they'd specifically targeted children. You know what's funny about the human brain? It can process the death of millions as a statistic, but the death of one child is a tragedy that reshapes your entire worldview. Matthews felt something fundamental shift inside him, like a tectonic plate moving deep beneath the surface of his consciousness. His hands moved without conscious thought, reassembling his sidearm with muscle memory, while his mind raced through possibilities. Pirates didn't target children bad for business, and likely to bring down the full weight of human military might. Slavers took prisoners. They didn't execute them. This was something else entirely. This was extermination. Matthews secured his weapon and sprinted for the bridge, his boots echoing through the narrow corridors of the Vengeance. The ship had been designed for efficiency, not comfort, and every surface was functional metal and composite materials. But right now, those cold surfaces felt reassuring, solid, real in a universe that had suddenly become uncertain and dangerous. He burst onto the bridge to find Lieutenant Amy Carter already at the communications array, her usually steady hands shaking as she worked the controls. Carter was one of the best officers in the fleet, a woman who could maintain perfect composure while coordinating 17 different conversations during a fleet engagement. Seeing her rattled sent another chill down Matthew's spine. "Report," he barked, falling into the command rhythm that had served him well for over a decade. "Sir," the signal came from the Arcturus sector, bearing 27 Mark IV. "That's deep in neutral space. No military presence for 50 light-years in any direction." Carter's voice was professional, but Matthews could hear the underlying tension. Signal strength suggests they were broadcasting on maximum power, probably trying to reach anyone who could help. "How many souls aboard the Promise?" Matthews asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Carter consulted her display, her face growing paler with each line she read. "Manifest shows 62 civilians, sir. Mixed transport families relocating to the Centauri colonies, some mining engineers heading to the belt stations, a few tourists." She paused, swallowed hard. 38 of them are listed as under 18 years of age. The bridge fell silent, except for the steady hum of the ship's systems. Matthews looked around at his crew. Good people, experienced spacers who'd seen their share of violence and tragedy, but every face reflected the same horror he felt growing in his chest. 38. Children. The thing about serving in the military, especially out here on the frontier, is that you develop a certain philosophical acceptance of death. Soldiers die, colonists sometimes die, miners working dangerous asteroids die. It's tragic, but it's part of the price humanity pays for expanding into the galaxy. But children are supposed to be protected. They're supposed to represent hope, the future, the reason why humanity reaches for the stars in the first place. When someone deliberately targets children, they've crossed a line that can never be uncrossed. Matthews felt his crew watching him, waiting for orders. These were people who'd followed him through asteroid fields and pirate attacks, who trusted his judgment implicitly. He could see in their eyes that they were all thinking the same thing he was. Whoever had done this needed to pay. "All hands. Battle stations," Matthews ordered, his voice carrying the deadly quiet authority that made junior officers stand straighter. "Plot a course for the Arcturus sector, maximum burn. I want us there in 18 hours. The bridge exploded into controlled activity. Navigation plotted the jump coordinates while engineering began the complex process of bringing the ship's hyperspace engines online. Weapons began charging their energy banks while the medical bay prepared for potential casualties. But Matthews wasn't done. He moved to his command console and began typing a message that would change the course of galactic history. The message was coded Priority Alpha reserved for threats to human civilization itself, and it would automatically route to every military installation, every colony defense force, every human ship within 100 light-years. That is, the Vengeance leaped into hyperspace, its engines creating a tunnel through the fabric of space-time itself. Matthews allowed himself one moment of grim satisfaction. By the time they reached the coordinates where the Promise had died, they wouldn't be alone. The human fleet would be converging like antibodies responding to an infection. The hunters, whoever they were, had just made the most catastrophic mistake in their species' history. They'd shown humanity what they were capable of, and now humanity was going to show them why Earth had conquered half the galaxy, not through superior technology or numbers, but through an absolutely relentless refusal to let threats to their people go unpunished. In the depths of hyperspace, racing toward a rendezvous with destiny, Commander Jake Matthews began planning for war. 20 hours of hyperspace travel gives you time to think, and Commander Jake Matthews had spent every minute of those 20 hours trying to prepare himself for what they might find at the coordinates where the Promise had sent her final transmission. He'd run through dozens of scenarios in his mind: pirates who'd gotten carried away, territorial disputes gone wrong, maybe even some kind of mechanical failure that had been misinterpreted in the chaos. The human mind, he'd learned over 15 years of military service, has an amazing capacity for hope, even when all logic points toward horror. But nothing absolutely. Nothing could have prepared him for the scene that materialized on the Vengeance's main view screen as they dropped out of hyperspace. Hell was floating in space, and it had a name: the wreckage of the cargo hauler Promise, the ship that had once been home to 62 human souls now hung in the void, like a broken toy discarded by a cosmic child with anger management issues. Her hull had been methodically torn apart by what the forensics computers were already identifying as military-grade energy weapons, not the crude plasma cannons favored by pirates or the improvised weapons of desperate colonists, but precision instruments designed for one purpose: killing efficiently and completely. Matthews stood on his bridge, staring at the destruction, feeling something die inside his chest. The Promise hadn't just been destroyed, she'd been dissected. Whole sections of the ship had been carefully removed, as if someone had wanted to examine the contents before disposing of them. This wasn't random violence, or even calculated piracy. This was systematic extermination, carried out with scientific precision. "Dear God," whispered Lieutenant Carter from her position at the communications console. Matthews turned to see tears streaming down her face, not the professional composure of a military officer, but the raw emotion of a human being confronting pure evil. And scattered around the main wreckage like seeds from a deadly flower were the escape pods. You know what's supposed to happen when a civilian ship comes under attack? The crew launches escape pods, sends out distress signals, and waits for rescue. It's basic space safety protocol, taught to every child old enough to walk. The escape pods are supposed to be sanctuary, the one place where even the most ruthless pirates will show mercy, because attacking life pods brings down the combined wrath of every civilized species in the galaxy. But most of these pods had been cracked open like eggs, their precious atmosphere venting into space in crystalline streams that caught the light of distant stars. Someone had deliberately hunted down the survivors and executed them one by one. "Life signs," Matthews demanded, though his voice sounded strange and distant even to his own ears. Ensign Tom Wilson, normally one of the steadiest young officers Matthews had ever served with, was hunched over his scanner console with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Wilson was barely 23, fresh out of the academy, and this was probably his first real taste of the universe's capacity for cruelty. 12 survivors, sir," Wilson managed, his voice cracking like a teenager's. "All children. The youngest is, double quotes." He stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. "Jesus Christ, sir. The youngest is 4 years old." 4 years old. Matthews felt something snap inside his chest, some last vestige of faith in the fundamental decency of intelligent life. A 4-year-old child, floating alone in space, in a damaged escape pod, probably crying for parents who would never answer. The rescue operation was a nightmare wrapped in a tragedy, and served with a side of pure rage. Matthews watched through the shuttle bay cameras as his people brought back the survivors, and each small figure carried on a stretcher drove another nail into his heart. These weren't casualties of war, or victims of random violence. They were the deliberate targets of something so evil that his military-trained mind struggled to process it. 10-year-old. Billy Thompson was the first one they brought aboard, and Matthews knew he'd carry the image to his grave. The boy clutched a stuffed bear with his remaining arm. The other had been severed cleanly by laser fire, the kind of precise amputation that suggested deliberate cruelty rather than collateral damage. The medical team was already working on him, but Matthews could see in their faces that some wounds go deeper than flesh and bone. 14-year-old Lisa Adams couldn't stop shaking. Not the trembling of someone who was cold or scared, but the full-body convulsions of a nervous system that had been pushed beyond its ability to cope. Her eyes stared at nothing, seeing horrors that would replay in her dreams for the rest of her life. The medical scanner showed no physical injuries, but Matthews knew that sometimes the worst wounds are invisible. But it was 16-year-old Mark Roberts who broke Matthews' heart completely. The boy was trying so hard to be brave, to be the man he thought he needed to be in this moment. But every few seconds his composure would crack and reveal the terrified child underneath. He sat on the edge of a medical bed, his clothes torn and blood-stained, telling his story in a voice that tried to sound steady but shook with suppressed trauma. "They came without warning," Mark whispered, his eyes focused on something beyond the bulkhead of the medical bay. No hails, no demands, no negotiation, just ... appeared. "Their ships looked wrong, sir, like they'd been grown instead of built." Matthews knelt beside the boy, fighting to keep his own voice steady. In all his years of command, he'd never felt so helpless. "What do you say to a child who's just watched his entire world die? Take your time, son. Can you tell me what they looked like?" Mark's hands clenched into fists, and Matthews could see the boy forcing himself to remember details that his mind wanted to forget. They were big, maybe 8 feet tall, walking on too many legs, like spiders, but wrong. Their faces. He shuddered. They had too many eyes, and they made this clicking sound when they talked. Ever notice how the human brain tries to categorize threats by comparing them to familiar things? Mark was trying to process aliens by comparing them to Earth. Spiders. But Matthews could tell from the boy's expression that the comparison fell short of capturing the true horror. When Dad tried to explain that we had transit permits, that we were just passing through their space on our way to the Centauri colonies, they just ... Mark's voice broke completely. "They just started shooting. And they were laughing, sir. This horrible clicking laughter, like they thought it was funny." Matthews felt his jaw clench so hard, he thought his teeth might crack. Professional soldiers, even enemy soldiers, didn't laugh while killing civilians. That was the behavior of something fundamentally broken, something that viewed other life forms as entertainment rather than beings deserving of basic dignity. Did they say anything else? Any indication of who they were or why they attacked? "They called themselves the Hive Collective," Mark said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Said we were contaminating their space with our presence. That soft-skins like us were a disease that needed to be cleansed." The Hive Collective. Matthews felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the recycled air of the ship's environmental system. He'd heard intelligence briefings about the collective, an aggressive insectoid species that had been expanding aggressively through several outer sectors. They considered themselves the apex evolutionary form and viewed all other species as inferior genetic mistakes that needed to be corrected. But they'd never directly attacked human civilians before. There had been minor territorial disputes, some aggressive posturing along contested borders, but nothing like this. This was escalation on a scale that changed everything. "Their ships, Mark, can you describe them?" The boy's eyes went wide, and Matthews could see him reliving the moment when death had come calling. "They looked like wasps, sir. Giant metal wasps with energy cannons where the stingers should be. And they moved like living things, not like machines. Biomechanical technology. The collective didn't just build their ships. They grew them. which meant these weren't standard military vessels but specialized hunting ships, designed specifically for tracking down and eliminating prey. Matthews stood slowly, his mind already racing ahead to the implications. The collective had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. They'd deliberately targeted human children, laughed while doing it, and called it cleansing. This wasn't a territorial dispute or a misunderstanding. This was a declaration of war wrapped in genocide. "Get these children to the medical bay," he ordered his crew, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people move faster without being told twice. "Full psychological evaluation and trauma counseling. And I want them transferred to the safest facility we can find as soon as possible." But even as he gave the orders, Matthews knew that safety was an illusion now. The collective had shown they were willing to hunt down civilians in neutral space. Nowhere was safe anymore. "And transmit everything we've found to Admiral Jackson at Fleet Command," Matthews continued. "Priority Alpha classification. Full forensic scans, survivor testimony, everything." As the Vengeance raced toward the nearest human station, Matthews composed a message that would change the course of galactic history. The words came easily because they were carved from pure rage, tempered by military discipline. "Admiral Jackson, the Hive Collective has initiated unprovoked attacks on human civilian vessels. 62 souls lost, including 38 children. This was not piracy or territorial dispute. This was systematic extermination. Request immediate authorization for total war protocols." He paused, stared at the message for a long moment, then added one final line. "They made it personal, sir. Time to show them why that was a mistake." The transmission raced through hyperspace toward Fleet Command, carrying with it the spark that would ignite humanity's fury across 1,000 worlds. Admiral Robert Jackson had been staring at the same report for 27 minutes, and the words hadn't changed. They still described the systematic slaughter of 62 human civilians, including 38 children, by an alien species that considered such acts to be routine pest control. The holographic images rotated slowly above his desk. Debris fields where families had been, toys floating in the vacuum where laughter should have been, escape pods cracked open like broken promises. His office on Luna Station overlooked the largest military anchorage in human space, where hundreds of warships floated in perfect geometric formations like sleeping giants waiting for their moment to wake. Jackson had commanded fleets for 32 years, had seen humanity's expansion from a single star system to a galactic power that spanned over 400 worlds. He'd fought pirates, negotiated with alien governments, and maintained the peace that allowed human civilization to flourish among the stars. But this morning, peace was a luxury humanity could no longer afford. The report from Commander Matthews aboard the Vengeance contained forensic details that made Jackson's stomach turn. The attackers hadn't just killed, they'd experimented. Energy weapon signatures showed deliberate variation in power settings, as if someone had been testing how much pain they could inflict before death. Children's bodies showed evidence of being hunted through the ship's corridors like animals in some twisted game. Jackson was a professional soldier, trained to compartmentalize emotion and focus on tactical realities. But he was also a grandfather, and the thought of his own grandchildren facing such horror made something primal and dangerous stir in his chest. The door to his office slid open without the courtesy of a chime, and Colonel Mary Peterson entered, with the kind of purposeful stride that meant the situation had just gotten worse. Peterson was his chief intelligence officer, a woman who'd earned her rank by being right about threats that others dismissed and wrong about almost nothing that mattered. If she was dispensing with protocol, the news she carried would be devastating. "Sir, we've confirmed 3 more attacks," she announced without preamble, her voice carrying the flat professionalism that military officers use when discussing the unthinkable. "The cargo ship Hope's End was hit 6 hours ago in the Vega system. The passenger liner New Dawn was destroyed near Alpha Centauri, and the research vessel, Bright Future. She paused, consulted her tablet. The Bright Future was conducting archaeological surveys in the Kepler system when she was attacked. Combined casualties across all 4 incidents, 237 civilians. Jackson felt the coffee mug in his hand grow warm as his grip tightened involuntarily. 237 people. Families heading to new colonies, scientists exploring ancient ruins, merchants carrying goods between worlds. All dead because some alien species had decided humanity needed to be exterminated. How many children, Mary? He asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. Peterson's professional composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the mother and human being beneath the uniform. 183 of them were under 18, sir. The youngest was... She swallowed hard. The youngest was 6 months old. The coffee mug exploded in Jackson's grip. The sound was sharp and violent in the quiet office. Ceramic fragments scattering across his desk, while hot liquid splashed across official documents. Blood welled from small cuts on his palm, mixing with the spilled coffee in a pattern that looked disturbingly like a map of human space reed, spreading through brown. Contamination through order. Neither officer looked at the mess. They'd both seen worse things in the last hour than a broken coffee cup and a little blood. The collective has been broadcasting on open channels, Peterson continued, apparently unfazed by her superior's loss of composure. They're calling it the Great Purification. They claim they're cleansing space of what they term inferior genetic contamination. They consider humans, and I quote, expendable pests whose rapid breeding threatens the natural order. Pests. Jackson's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But there was something in that whisper that made Colonel Peterson take an involuntary step backward. They think we're pests. You know what's interesting about the human capacity for rage? Most emotions build gradually, love grows over time, fear accumulates through experience, joy develops through shared moments, but rage can go from 0 to apocalyptic in the space between heartbeats, especially when someone threatens the things you've sworn to protect. Jackson stood slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled in the way that predators move when they've locked on to prey. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window that dominated one wall of his office, looking out at the fleet anchorage that stretched beyond the horizon of Luna's surface. Hundreds of human warships floated in perfect formation, destroyers bristling with missile pods, cruisers whose energy banks could glass a planet, carriers pregnant with fighter squadrons that could darken a star system's sky. For 3 decades, that fleet had been humanity's insurance policy, the guarantee that allowed civilian ships to carry families and dreams to distant worlds without fear. The crews aboard those ships trained constantly for threats that most hoped would never come. They were professional warriors in an age when most humans had never seen war. That was about to change. Colonel, activate the Terran War Protocol, Jackson said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute authority that comes from 3 decades of command, and the certain knowledge that you're about to make a decision that will reshape galactic history. Every ship, every marine, every pilot, I want the entire 8th Fleet ready for deployment in 18 hours. Peterson's tablet slipped from her suddenly nerveless fingers. The Terran War Protocol hadn't been activated since the Centauri Rebellion 40 years ago, and even then, it had been a limited engagement against human separatists. What Jackson was proposing was total mobilization, the complete military might of humanity unleashed against an alien species. Sir, that's over 600 vessels, she managed. Are we really? They killed our children, Mary? Jackson turned from the window, and Peterson found herself looking into eyes that held all the warmth of interstellar space. They hunted them through their ships like animals. They laughed while they did it, and they called it pest control. The words hung in the air between them like a declaration of war, which in fact they were. Peterson had served under Jackson for 8 years, had seen him navigate complex diplomatic crises and make decisions that affected the lives of billions. But she'd never seen him like this controlled fury, wrapped in military discipline, the kind of cold rage that could burn for centuries without ever being satisfied. There will be no negotiation, Jackson continued, moving to his desk and beginning to type on the military communication array that could reach every human military installation in the galaxy simultaneously. No mercy, no quarter given. The collective has shown us what they think of human life. Time to show them what humans think of extinction. His fingers moved across the holographic keyboard with practiced efficiency. Each word he typed carrying the weight of civilization's fury. The message would propagate through the quantum communication network, reaching fleet commanders and colonial defense forces from the core worlds to the frontier territories in a matter of hours. Authorization code, Alpha 77 Omega, he dictated as he typed. All human military forces are hereby ordered to assume full combat readiness. Objective, total elimination of the Hive Collective as a threat to human civilization. Rules of engagement, none. They wanted to see what pests could do. Jackson paused, looked up at Peterson with something that might have been a smile of smiles, could be made of pure malice. Let's show them why humans conquered half a galaxy, not through superior technology or numbers, but because we're the only species in the known universe that refuses to go extinct quietly. The transmission raced through hyperspace toward 1,000 worlds, carrying with it the promise of retribution on a scale the galaxy had never seen. And in his office overlooking humanity's sleeping war machine, Admiral Robert Jackson began planning the systematic destruction of an entire alien civilization. After all, the collective had taught humanity a valuable lesson about the nature of pest control. Time to return the favor. Hive Prime Sector had ruled the collective's border territories for 67 cycles, and in all that time, he had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with overwhelming force and calculated brutality. The collective's philosophy was elegantly simple. Superior species dominated inferior ones, and anything that wasn't insectoid was by definition inferior. It was a worldview that had served them well through centuries of expansion, allowing them to claim 17 star systems and eliminate 12 different species that had been foolish enough to resist their natural superiority. The humans, he had calculated, would be no different. Sekthar-S command ship. The Sovereign Mandible hung in perfect formation with the rest of his border fleet at the edge of what the humans called the Arcturus sector. 160 vessels of varying sizes, from nimble scout hunters to massive dreadnought hives, all bristling with biomechanical weapon systems that had been grown rather than built. Each ship was a living extension of the collective's will, capable of independent thought, but bound absolutely to the hive mind that connected every member of their species. When the first hyperspace signatures began appearing on his sensors, Sekthar felt a flutter of what lesser species might call anticipation. The humans were coming, exactly as predicted. A few patrol ships, perhaps a small battle group, sent to make angry noises about the recent cleansing operations. The collective's xenobiologists had analyzed human psychology extensively. They were an emotional species, prone to irrational outbursts when their young were threatened, but ultimately pragmatic enough to back down when faced with superior force. The first ship to emerge from hyperspace was a human dreadnought, its hull scarred by decades of service, but bristling with enough firepower to level a small moon. Sekthar-S tactical officer clicked approval. Impressive for a soft-skinned vessel, but hardly threatening to a fleet of their size. Then the second ship appeared, and the third, and the fourth. Tactical assessment, Sekthar commanded, his confidence beginning to waver as more and more human vessels materialized from the folded space of hyperspace jumps. Initial count at 47 vessels and climbing. His tactical officer reported, compound eyes focused intently on the sensor displays. Configuration suggests a full battle fleet rather than a patrol group. Sekthar-S mandibles clicked in what passed for collective laughter. 47 ships was more than expected, but still well within acceptable parameters. The humans were apparently taking their pest control operations more seriously than anticipated. But numbers alone wouldn't save them from the collectives. Superior technology and tactical doctrine, but the ships kept coming. Ever notice how your brain processes impossible things? First comes denial, this can't be happening. Then bargaining, maybe the sensors are malfunctioning. Then anger, when you realize that yes, this is really happening, and no, you can't make it stop by wishing hard enough. Sekthar was experiencing all three emotions simultaneously as human warships continued to pour out of hyperspace like an unstoppable tide of steel and fury. Massive carriers disgorged clouds of fighters that swarmed around their mother ships like angry hornets. Cruisers took defensive positions, while destroyers formed screening formations that spoke of military doctrine refined through centuries of warfare. Current count, Sekthar demanded, though his voice carried less certainty than it had moments before. 743 confirmed vessels, his tactical officer reported, his usual clicking confidence replaced by something that sounded disturbingly like fear. Multiple ship classes, from patrol craft to super dreadnoughts, and sir, more are still arriving. 743 ships. Sekthar's own fleet numbered 160 vessels, most of them smaller scout hunters optimized for pursuing fleeing civilians rather than engaging military formations. For the first time in his long life, mathematical reality was forcing him to confront the possibility that the collective might not be as invincible as their philosophy claimed, but it was what he saw painted on the human ship's hulls that truly sent ice through his chitinous frame. Every vessel bore the same message, painted in letters large enough to be read from across a star system. Remember the children. Not tactical designations or fleet numbers, but a promise of retribution that spoke to something primal and terrifying about human nature. The communication request came from the largest human vessel, a super dreadnought that dwarfed even the sovereign mandible. Sekthar accepted the transmission, expecting the usual diplomatic posturing that preceded most military confrontations. Admiral Robert Jackson's face appeared on the screen, and Sekthar immediately understood that this would not be a normal negotiation. The human's eyes held no emotion, not anger, not hatred, just the cold calculation of a predator that had already decided its prey was going to die. Hive Prime Sekthar, Jackson said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made even experienced warriors pay attention. I am Admiral Robert Jackson of the Terran Federation Navy. You have 24 hours to surrender the commanders responsible for the massacre of innocent civilians aboard the vessel's Promise, Asterisk Hopes, and New Dawn and Bright Future, Asterisk. Massacre. Sekthar's mandibles clacked in genuine amusement. These softskins truly didn't understand the natural order of things. Massacre. Admiral, we eliminated vermin that was infesting our territory. This is standard pest control, as recognized by galactic law regarding territorial sovereignty. You murdered children. The words hung in space between them, carrying a weight that Sekthar didn't fully comprehend. In collective society, young were resources to be allocated efficiently. The concept of childhood as something sacred was alien to his species' hive mentality. We purged inferior genetic material, as nature demands, Sekthar replied, genuinely puzzled by the human's emotional response. Surely you understand the necessity of preventing contamination by lesser species. Jackson's expression never changed, but something shifted behind his eyes. Something that made Sekthar's survival instincts scream warnings that his rational mind couldn't quite process. Then nature demands you pay the price. The transmission ended with a finality that left Sekthar staring at a blank screen, trying to process what had just occurred. In his 67 cycles of command, he'd negotiated with dozens of species, and every single one had eventually accepted the collective's superior position through logic, fear, or simple pragmatism. But this human admiral hadn't negotiated at all. He'd delivered an ultimatum, with the certainty of someone announcing a scientific law. 12 hours later, the human fleet began to advance. That's when Sekthar noticed something that made his blood run cold in his veins. Painted beneath each ship's name wasn't tactical information or fleet designations. They were photographs, hundreds of them, thousands of them, covering every hull with images of human faces, old faces and young faces, smiling grandparents and serious-looking middle-aged adults, teenagers with the awkward confidence of youth, and children with gap-toothed grins, and babies, so many babies. Their tiny faces staring out from the hulls of warships, like accusations made manifest, the faces of the dead from the promise, the hope's end, the new dawn, and the bright future. Every single person the collective had killed in their pest control operations, memorialized on the instruments of their vengeance. "Sir," his tactical officer reported, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sensor analysis indicates that every human vessel is operating at maximum combat efficiency. Energy signatures suggest they've removed all non-essential systems to maximize weapons and shield capacity." Sekthar felt his compound eyes widen in horror as the implications sank in. The humans hadn't come to negotiate, or posture, or make territorial demands. They'd stripped their ships down to pure instruments of war, removing everything that wasn't directly related to killing. This wasn't a military operation, it was an extermination fleet. "They're not here for territory," Sekthar realized aloud, his voice carrying a note of panic that his crew had never heard before. "They're not here for resources or strategic advantage. Then why are they here?" His tactical officer asked. Sekthar looked at the advancing wall of human warships, each one carrying the faces of the dead like battle standards, and finally understood the magnitude of the mistake the collective had made. "They came for vengeance," he whispered. "And vengeance, it appears, is something humans have perfected beyond any other species in the galaxy." The human fleet continued its inexorable advance, and for the first time in collective history, Sekthar began composing a message to the home hives that contained a word no collective commander had ever been forced to use in official communications: retreat. But as he watched those faces staring at him from across the void, he wondered if retreat would even be possible against a species that had turned grief into a weapon and mourning into a declaration of war. The first battle at Arcturus Prime lasted 8 hours and 17 minutes. And when the smoke cleared from the wreckage of what had once been Hive Prime Sekhtar's border fleet, the galaxy understood that something fundamental had changed in the cosmic order. The collective had brought 160 warships to the fight. The humans had brought 743. When the engagement ended, exactly 0 collective vessels remained operational. While the human fleet had lost only 22 ships, a casualty ratio that military historians would study for centuries. But here's the thing about starting a war with humanity. Winning the first battle is just the beginning of your problems. Admiral Jackson stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the final collective dreadnought hive break apart under concentrated fire from 6 human cruisers. The alien vessel's biomechanical hull cracked like an eggshell, spilling atmosphere and biofluid into the vacuum of space in patterns that looked disturbingly organic. Part of him felt a flicker of something that might once have been sympathy for the dying alien crew, but that part was buried deep beneath. 8 months of accumulated rage in the faces of 237 dead civilians. The collective had wanted to show humanity what happened to pests who infested their territory. Instead, they'd taught the galaxy's most dangerous predator species that their children weren't safe. It was, Jackson reflected grimly, possibly the most catastrophic miscalculation in the recorded history of interstellar warfare. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, "we're receiving surrender broadcasts from the remaining collective installations in this system. They're requesting terms." Jackson's smile was colder than the space between stars. "Tell them we don't negotiate with exterminators. They can surrender unconditionally or join their friends in the debris field. What followed wasn't a war in the traditional sense, it was systematic extermination, dressed up in military terminology. For every collective world that raised the white flag of surrender, 5 more chose to fight to the death rather than submit to human justice. And for every human ship that fell to collective bioweapons, 20 more arrived from the core worlds, their hulls painted with the names and faces of new martyrs, their crews burning with fresh fury. The galaxy watched in growing horror as humanity stripped away the veneer of civilization that had fooled everyone, including themselves, for 3 centuries. These weren't the diplomatic explorers who'd negotiated trade agreements and cultural exchanges with dozens of species. These weren't the peaceful colonists who'd asked permission before settling new worlds and paid fair prices for alien technology. These were apex predators who'd clawed their way from a single blue planet to control 400 star systems. And they'd done it not through superior technology or overwhelming numbers, but through an absolutely relentless refusal to accept defeat when their young were threatened. You know what's terrifying about humans in wartime? Most species fight until the cost becomes too high, then negotiate a settlement that saves face for everyone involved. Humans fight until their enemy no longer exists as a threat, and they're willing to sacrifice everything to achieve that goal. The collective learned this lesson system by system, world by world, as human fleets methodically reduced their civilization to rubble. Commander Jake Matthews, now Admiral Matthews, after 3 battlefield promotions and the death of his superior officers, led the final assault on the collective homeworld. The planet hung before his fleet like a massive hive, its surface covered with biomechanical cities that pulsed with organic light. Billions of collective drones lived and worked in those cities, most of them innocent of any involvement in the massacre that had started this war. Matthews stood on his bridge, looking at those cities, and felt absolutely nothing. 8 months of war had burned out his capacity for mercy, leaving behind only the cold calculation of a man who'd seen too many human children's bodies floating in space. All ships, he broadcast to his fleet, commence planetary bombardment. Military targets only, but be thorough. I want their capacity for violence eliminated permanently. The bombardment lasted 6 hours, and when it ended, the collective's ability to wage war had been reduced to scrap metal and organic debris. The supreme heave, the collective consciousness that ruled their species, transmitted its surrender from the deepest bunker on the planet, its mental voice carrying a note of panic that no collective leader had ever before experienced. We yield. The message pulsed through hyperspace to Admiral Jackson aboard his flagship. We accept defeat. We beg for mercy in the name of our young who had no part in this conflict. Jackson's response was broadcast on every frequency in the galaxy, ensuring that every species capable of receiving radio signals would hear humanity's terms: complete and unconditional surrender, dismantlement of all military forces, reparations to the families of every human killed in your pest control operations, and a memorial to every murdered child on every world you control, maintained in perpetuity as a reminder of the price of targeting innocence. But the real victory, the one that would reshape galactic politics for generations, was deeper than military conquest or imposed terms. Every species in the galaxy now understood the fundamental truth about humans: they would cross any distance, pay any price, sacrifice any amount of blood and treasure to protect their young. The collective had thought they were dealing with soft emotional creatures who could be intimidated into submission. Instead, they'd awakened something that wouldn't stop until their entire civilization was extinct. 5 years after the war ended, Admiral Matthews stood in the central plaza of what had once been the collective homeworld's capital city. The biomechanical spires had been replaced with more conventional architecture, and the plaza itself had been redesigned around a memorial that dominated the city center. 237 names were carved into black stone, each one representing a life cut short by alien cruelty. The inscription was simple, brutal, and absolutely final. They were our future. You took them from us. We took everything from you. Mark Roberts stood beside him. No longer the traumatized 16-year-old who'd watched his family die aboard the Promise. The young man wore the uniform of a fleet officer, his chest decorated with the silver star of valor he'd earned during the final assault on this very world. His hands, once shaking with trauma, now held steady as he placed a wreath at the memorial's base. "Was it worth it, sir?" Mark asked quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 8 months of total war and the deaths of over 2 million human military personnel. Matthews looked around the peaceful plaza, watching human children play alongside young collective drones, under the watchful eyes of parents from both species. Former enemies now lived as neighbors, bound together by the hard-learned lesson that some lines must never be crossed. The collective young had been taught to speak human languages, to understand human customs, and most importantly, to remember why their civilization had fallen. "Ask me that question again, when no mother has to watch her child die in space," Matthews replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who'd seen the absolute worst that intelligent life could offer, and had decided to burn it all down rather than let it continue in the distance. A small collective youngling carefully placed a flower at the memorial's base, a gesture taught by human friends who'd lost everything but refused to let hatred poison their children's future. The small act carried a promise that echoed across the stars, a reminder that even the most terrible wars could sometimes teach lessons worth learning. The galaxy had learned that humanity's capacity for violence was matched only by their commitment to justice. The dead had been avenged in ways that would echo through history. The future was secured by the absolute certainty that anyone who threatened human children would face consequences beyond their ability to imagine or survive. And humanity remembered everything, every name, every face, every moment of loss that had driven them to remake the galaxy in the image of their grief. They remembered, and they made sure everyone else remembered too, because some prices, once paid, in blood and terror, never need to be paid again. The end.